woman whose testimony I took quite early in the war. She really only reported the crime because the in-laws pushed her to, because her husband had been killed by the soldiers who then raped her. So they were very quickly able to identify him, because he revealed his identity to his victim. And he's been tried in absentia, so they've secured that conviction. But yeah, you wonder, how satisfying is that? And I think exposing the systematic nature of the violence is very important, because I think that may help survivors feel less to blame or personally culpable if they see this as part of the Russian war machine.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with Lucy Fisher for Times Radio. I'm delighted today to be joined by a fantastic panel of guests to discuss a really big subject: how women and girls have been affected by the conflict in Ukraine and how they've played a crucial role in the fight. With me to discuss this big topic are Dr. Karen von Hippel, Director General of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which is the world's oldest and the UK's leading defence and security think tank. Karen was previously a senior advisor on counterterrorism at the US State Department, then a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, and following that, Chief of Staff to Obama's Special Presidential Envoy for the Global Coalition to counter ISIL. That's a mouthful. Karen holds degrees from Yale, Oxford and the LSE, and has numerous publications to her name. We're also joined by the Times' very own award-winning foreign correspondent, Catherine Philp. Catherine, you are one of Britain's most experienced foreign correspondents, having covered 5 continents in nearly 20 years for The Times. You've been based in overseas bureaus and reported on conflicts from Afghanistan to Colombia and won a series of international press awards. We're particularly lucky to have Catherine today, as she's just jetted back from Baghdad, but she has spent a huge proportion of the past year in Ukraine, and I think most recently was there 3 weeks ago, so she'll be telling us about her view from the ground. And finally, Anna Kvit is from Kyiv in Ukraine and is a visiting research fellow at University College London. Anna's research is focused on gender equality and women's rights in Ukraine's military community, so she's the perfect authority on the subject we're going to get into. Anna has also worked for international and civil society organisations and has contributed to policy development on implementing the United Nations Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Ukraine. Welcome all 3 of you. So, we'll come on to the specific aspects of the war that affect women and girls, but our regular viewers of Frontline are very keen to know about the current state of play on the ground in Ukraine and some of the evolving geopolitics around that. So, Catherine, I think it makes sense to start with you, given you've been there so recently. Give us an appraisal of where the war is at on the ground.
Well, I was there on the first anniversary, and there was a lot of talk about dueling offensives from both sides, that the Russians might try to mark the anniversary with a new sort of invasion, a re-invasion, a sort of something along the lines of what they'd done a year before, and we didn't see that happen. What we're seeing on the ground at the moment in Ukraine is that the battle lines are quite static. I think that's to be expected over the winter, of course, because the fighting's been more difficult at that stage. And there is this very brutal fight that I think everyone now is aware of the name of Bakhmut, which is sort of incongruous to me because it is quite a small town in the east and has taken on this enormous symbolic significance. But in terms of movement along on the ground, we haven't seen a great deal. I think because the Ukrainians are still waiting for a lot of weaponry to arrive from the West. And so there's talk that they may be in a position to launch an offensive to take back more of the ground that was lost in the original invasion. Obviously, the Russians went further with their attempt to take down the civilian infrastructure and sort of freeze the Ukraine into submission over the winter. I think that we saw that actually that effort largely failed due to some extraordinary efforts by the Ukrainians, both to use their air defences against the missiles, incoming missiles, but also their determination to keep the grid on and to keep things going. And they've really had to scale up to do that. So whereas electricity and water have gone out periodically across the country, life has been difficult for civilians, it hasn't been impossible, and the Russians did not achieve what they wanted in that time. We're now going into spring, and things may start to get more lively on the ground.
We shall see. And Karen, I know you follow the geopolitics around the war very closely. At the moment, I know it's slightly difficult to comment on it because it's happening right now, but we know Xi Jinping is in Moscow talking to Vladimir Putin. What is China's evolving attitude towards the war say to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. China is the one country that potentially could influence Vladimir Putin. Xi in particular, they met several dozen times already. I think 40 times since they've both been in these leadership positions. But so far, China hasn't really played the role that many hoped that it would play, more of a peacemaker role. I know they published their statement of principles. Really, they said it was a peace plan. It wasn't a peace plan. It was more principles about conflict. So it's really hard to say. I think that in some ways, China doesn't like this conflict continuing. On the other hand, they don't want a weakened Russia as well. So they're in a little bit of a sticky situation. I wouldn't be too hopeful about this meeting, unfortunately. I think the main part has already happened, the private meeting between the two. Now there's some public events. It's a 3-day visit. So unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see too much out of this.
Do you think China is going to step up the supply of weapons to Russia?
Yeah, that's a big concern. I think that would be a game changer with the United States in particular. And I think they know that. I think there may be some dual-use technology they've been providing already to the Russians, or some reports that maybe some drones have already gone over. But I think that if it's ramped up and the Americans release intelligence on it, I think that would be a game changer on China and China's relationship with the West. China has, important investments in Europe. They've already lost a number of friends. Remember in 2012, they established this 17+1 initiative in Southern and Eastern Europe. They've already lost 4 of those countries, or 3 of those countries, now 14+1. And many Europeans are upset with them precisely for their support for Russia. And they don't want, a war doesn't help China either. So I think that it's not their preferred outcome, but I'm not quite sure what they're going to do about it.
We'll have to keep watching closely. And Anna, another recent development, of course, is the International Criminal Court issuing an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin over the alleged kidnap and deportation of Ukrainian children. As a Ukrainian, tell us a bit about the impact this sickening war crime has had on the morale of the nation.
It had a big impact, and usually we see in the news that women and children are victims of this war, which is undoubtedly so. But the other side of the effect is that it mobilized the population, and it mobilized women as well. And there was recently a survey according to the results of which majority of population would be ready to defend their country and their territory, their community, their home with arms if needed. And this survey, the same question was asked 1 year ago in March 2022. And the majority of population answered that yes, they are ready to do this, not as a part of armed forces, but like if they have to. And back at that time, we thought that it was because of the shock, because of the stress and of the situation. But a year later, there is still many people who are ready to fight back, and they're very decisive about it. But this is about the attitudes. But in general, majority of the population just had to deal with a lot of difficulties and challenges, especially women. And it mobilized them as well.
So in a way, perhaps it slightly backfired on Vladimir Putin?
The kidnapping of the children is an outrageous crime, which I think it shocked everybody. The kidnapping of children, forceful deportation of children, of Ukrainian children to Russia, and bringing them up as Russian children is not only forbidden, but it's a sign of a genocide. And it's on the ground. There are many stories of Ukrainians in orphanages, for example, trying to hide those kids. For example, in Kherson and in Kherson region, there are cases when people working in an orphanage, they were hiding kids for months, and they succeeded in it. They managed to keep some children in Ukraine, but it's just really devastating that people have to go through this.
Can I come in on that? Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, I mean, when that arrest warrant was issued for Putin, it was quite a moment of inhalation, because it is a very bold move. I think that the reason that that particular war crime was chosen as the one to be the subject of the first arrest warrant was that it was systematic. It was obviously ordered by the highest echelon. So Putin must have been behind it. They must be able to. That, as you said, it is one of the indicators of genocide, and those are the crimes that prosecutors within Ukraine are focusing on. Those that they feel that can be passed to the ICC, the worst crimes. But also that the Russians have made no secret of the fact that they've been abducting children. So it's almost like it's almost the easiest case to prove, because they've admitted it. They boast about it. We're bringing them up as Russians. They claim it's a humanitarian act. And I think there was some reaction, wasn't there, from the Children's Commissioner after the arrest warrant came out, where again, she just reinforced the notion that they were doing this. So it's something Russia's been very open about, bizarrely.
Yeah.
And you do kind of wonder, why are they doing it? Because you can't steal all the children. So why are you even stealing a few of them?
They apparently they seem not to recognize it as a crime. They are very open about it, that they are saving children, and they talk about this in the media, and they made the statements that at the beginning we had problems because kids were singing Ukrainian anthem, but it got better later. So this is their view, that we managed to adjust them, to change them. Now they're not singing Ukrainian anthem. Now they're like proper Russian local kids.
Yeah, the kind of re-education we've seen in so many other nations too. Karen, can I ask you, how realistic is it, the idea that Putin himself could ever face charges at the ICC? And what sort of model do you think any tribunal should take?
Well, I was going to say, just to respond in a way slightly differently from Catherine, I don't think it's as shocking in a sense, because he's already in many ways shown he's a war criminal, right? I mean, I don't see how any other Western leader could ever meet with him after this war, because I'm going to assume he's going to stay in power, right? I mean, we'd like for him to leave, obviously, but let's just assume he stays in power. He's already a pariah. He's already committed so many war crimes beyond, obviously, the stealing of the children. So in a sense, we're already in a very awkward position going forward. How do you negotiate with him? Who sits down with him? How does any world leader shake his hand? There are lots of models for how the ICC could do it if the ICC chooses to do it, or they could set up a subsidiary court to do it, or it could be some sort of hybrid court with Ukrainian judges and Western judges. It really would depend on, who can arrest him if he does get arrested, and then they would take it from there. I mean, it can be many, many years before he's brought to justice, but I think at some point he will meet justice of some form or another.
Interesting. Catherine, we know that the EU's just signed off this huge €2 billion package to try and supply Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells. As well as that, we've got the Japanese premier in Kyiv this week also talking to Volodymyr Zelensky. To what extent is the wider global community of democracies getting behind Ukraine outside of the European and American nations that make up NATO?
No, it's a very good point. It's not as broad as we might assume. You often hear Zelensky say things like the whole world is behind Ukraine, but it's not really true. And I've heard from, I've spoken to European diplomats who've fretted over this and said it's really Western support, isn't it, not global support. So very markedly, large countries like Brazil, South Africa, critically India, have not come to see the war through the lens of the NATO member countries, and have continued to provide economic lifeline to Russia. I mean, India's purchase of Russian oil has sort of gone through the roof since the conflict began. So in that sense, there hasn't been the breadth of coalition that might have brought Russia to its knees economically much sooner, and perhaps why we're seeing a perhaps more limited effect of sanctions than we would have liked. And so that's, that's sort of the economics of the situation, well beyond who's actually supplying arms or ammunition, which I don't think it is ever going to broaden beyond what you see now. I think anyone who's going to give arms has given them and continues to give them. I think it's really a question of Russia's place in the world and Russia's economics. It's trading with other countries like China, like India, like Brazil.
And if I could jump in on that, it's also political support too. So don't forget at the March UNGA, UN General Assembly resolution, and after the war started, deploring the Russian aggression of Ukraine, 35 countries abstained, and then you had a few that voted against, the usual suspects. The vote on February 23rd this year, 32 abstained, and those abstainers are not mostly fence sitters. Actually, they're buying into the Russian and Chinese narrative, unfortunately. And so that's also been a surprise to many Western leaders, as we thought, oh, well, everyone agrees, everyone's on board with us, but they're not. And you hear, the arguments are everything from, well, this is, a white person war, European war. What about our conflicts that you didn't care about? It's not our problem. But then you also hear people buying into this neo-colonialist Western, what the Russians have been perpetuating this argument, and many countries are buying into it. Now, there's a number of reasons why. I mean, the Russians have been very good at misinformation in Africa and elsewhere. The Russians have also, during the Soviet period, of course, supported liberation movements, Angola, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, South Africa, and those countries are still grateful for that. And then, of course, we have Chinese investments all over the global South. And so there are many countries that are just saying, nope, you know what, our future's with these guys. Some are still on the fence. Some say we don't want to choose, but many, unfortunately, are on the wrong side of this.
You're right. There are a lot of factors that lead to many, particularly in the global South, perhaps either backing Russia or taking a slightly ambiguous stance. What more could the West or the wider kind of community of global democracies be doing to sort of change the dial?
Yeah, I think the West could do more, and Zelensky obviously is trying to reach out, have a meeting with Xi. He hasn't been able to have a meeting with Xi yet. I think the Ukrainians, understandably, were very focused on the West for obvious reasons, so I think they're thinking more about how to reach out to these countries. And then I think you need to bring in not the usual suspects. I don't think it helps to have the French or the Americans or the Brits trying to defend that they're not imperialist countries, actually. I think you need the countries of the former Soviet Union, maybe the Balts, Central and East Europeans, who actually can say, let me tell you what Russian imperialism is like. We lived through this. Let me explain what it was like. It doesn't necessarily help, or it doesn't help when you have Western leaders saying they need to know how generous we are, because that just isn't the right way to do it.
I think it was quite striking in Kyiv on the anniversary of the invasion. Zelensky held a press conference, and it went on for a very long time. And one of the reasons it went on for so long was he was absolutely determined to get round all the media from different countries around the globe. So he was very careful to pick out Latin American representatives of the media. A Chinese journalist was there. And that's when he first said that he was prepared to talk to Xi. And you got this sense, it was like, my goodness, he's been harder on Germany during the course of this war than he is on China. He's very carefully not trying to exclude anyone or any regions of the world now that, Ukraine is trying to appeal to a broader audience of support globally.
Yeah, interesting. I think Zelensky is playing a very kind of canny game when it comes to democracy. And Karen, on your point, you remind me there's a great column in The Times this week by William Hague, who was also suggesting that Baltic leaders should go on tour to try and sell the message you talk about. I think we should move to talk a bit more, unless you want to come in there, Anna, about some of the gendered aspects of this war. And to start with, I just want to sort of throw up a question to all of you, but I guess particularly to you, Anna, coming from Ukraine. I think it's fair to say there is a slight generalised view in the West that slightly more traditional gender norms applied in Ukraine before the war than perhaps other parts of the West. Do you think that's right? And how has the role of women changed during the past year of the conflict?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. Ukrainian view on gender norms is rather traditional. So women do make about like 3 times more domestic work, and they take care of children, they cook, they're expected to be very feminine. They now they are also expected to work, but it doesn't mean that they have to abandon all the housework and children and the rest of it.
Sounds just like
that's. But with the beginning of the war, which was in 2013, women started joining armed forces of Ukraine voluntarily. They were not mobilized. It was their own decision, and they were really discouraged to do that. They armed forces of Ukraine didn't want to take them. Their relatives also were telling that it's really not a good idea. And since then, there have been changes around that, because if back in 2014, for example, women were not, according to the law, they couldn't occupy combat positions, for example. In the army, they could do something which is called support work. So now they officially can occupy all the positions they want. There are more than 2 times, like number of women in the armed forces has increased 2 times, even more. And we have 3 times more women officers in the armed forces. So it has changed. And the perception of women in the armed forces is also changing. Because again, as a sociologist, I check the results of the polls, and in 2018 we did a research and we asked the adult population of Ukraine, what do you think about gender equality in the armed forces? Should women and men have equal rights? And 53% of population said yes, they should have only 53%. And in 2022 we asked the same question, and 80% of population think that yes, women and men should have equal rights. But also, I could say that we have a new image of a modern Ukrainian woman, because women in the uniform and women with arms, it's already not that striking. It gradually becomes normal. We have many articles and videos about women in the army, and they are portrayed as professionals, as in the military. They also are portrayed as good mothers, or that they have families, so they try to show them from different sides. It becomes new normal. I don't know if it will remain so, because we know from history that usually after the end of the war, women are expected to come back to traditional gender roles and take care of children and be very feminine again and forget about all they did during the war. But I don't think that it will happen in Ukraine because you cannot take back this 9 years of experience and this experience that women in the military and civilian women have now, because many civilian women also have to deal with new challenges, with new roles and responsibilities that they were not expected to do before. Yeah, please.
Well, I've met so many women, Ukrainian women parliamentarians. Is it more than before, or were there always a lot of women parliamentarians?
It's the highest number we ever had. In this parliament, it's 21% of women. It used to be less. So yeah, we have. And yes, they all stayed. Ukrainian parliament works since 24th of February 2022. They all stayed and they vote and they do their work. They travel.
So they're traveling everywhere. Meet them all over the conferences.
Yeah, no, they're natural diplomats, aren't they? For Ukraine, right?
Yeah, they're very outspoken and they're everywhere. And they're all on message too. It's super impressive. Your whole communications. Yeah. With the president on down, right? I mean, it's super impressive.
And the optics as well. And you're right to say it's not so unusual anymore, but I remember some of the female MPs, I think Kira Rudik and others, sort of holding rifles on the streets of Kyiv when the invasion started, and that was an amazing sort of image to behold.
Yeah, these images, they could be striking at the beginning, but now it's just a normal Ukrainian woman with a gun. And there were actually another image that I really liked. Some women joined territorial defense last February and March. And there was a photo of woman with a gun. I don't know the name in English. What is the big gun? behind her back and she's holding her daughter, and they're walking towards the railway station. So it's just a normal day, which is, well, obviously not normal, but this was a very famous photo, and I think it represented the reality during that period of time.
Now, Catherine, you've obviously travelled across swathes of Ukraine while reporting on this war. Have you come across female soldiers? And I wanted to ask you, what challenges have they had to adapt to? What have they told you? And what else have you sort of taken in of the way that women's roles have changed during the conflict?
Yes, I mean, you do come across women soldiers. They're not, it's not sort of one woman alone in a trench of men. They tend to be a smattering. I've come across women in all sorts of roles, like a female sniper, a female drone operators, just doing all the sorts of things in the military that the men are doing. Because they're not mobilised, they have, signed up themselves, they volunteer. So I do remember at the very beginning of the war, like meeting a group of women who'd gone to volunteer for the territorial defence, and one of them was crying, holding a weapon because she was scared of. I think it was the tension as well. But I said, you okay? And she went, I've never held a gun before, and so she was sort of crying with the stress of it. But she's still out there in the Donbass now, and she's a soldier. And so it's true of the men too, that in Bakhmut, many of these men dying now are shopkeepers and bus drivers. So, goodness, how has the war affected women? Our war always affects women from the most horrible, brutal ways, like rape as a weapon of war, which is something that has happened in communities that have been occupied by the Russians, and it is utterly systematic. When you hear about how it's conducted, that the Russians appear to have this sort of playbook when they come into a place, and how they behave with the civilian population after they've taken control, who they look for, and the fact that they use sexual violence against women. So that is a terror for women who are in those areas that get taken over. In the areas that the Russians have never come, in the west of Ukraine, for example, where people feel more safe and haven't left the country. So, as you'll be aware, Lucy, that women can leave the country and can leave with their children, but men cannot. So the vast majority of those who have left are women. But in the communities where people felt safer and felt able to stay, you just see a bit more of women taking up sort of community leadership roles. And it's not uncommon in Western Ukraine to go to a town or a village where there really aren't that many men left, because a lot of the fighters have come from the West. And so it's really the women who are kind of stepping up in local governance and as community leaders. There are professional women doctors, all the roles that you might expect, judges. There's a lot of female prosecutors actually involved in the war crimes investigation, because the Ukraine just sort of had to swipe up all the prosecutors it had. So, I've met prosecutors who were involved in economic crimes who are now being sent into Kherson to collect evidence of war crimes. So I think everyone stepped up to different roles than those they used to, including women.
It's interesting. I suspect that part of the reason women are playing such a prominent role is exactly what you just said, because men can't, because they're fighting. And so they've just stepped up to the plate, and that's probably why we're seeing so many of them. I hadn't even thought about that until you mentioned that.
Well, if you think of World War I, and that was really what vindicated the suffragettes, was that the women had to step into the male.
Right, but they're in factories and stuff now.
Yes, that's true. No, it's much more out. Yeah,
they're doing a lot of the advocacy roles. I only anecdotally, I don't have the same experiences. I met a group of Ukrainian soldiers, a young group that was over here training with the Brits, and there were two very young women, and you just sort of, you get so worried about, the young men and young women. And there was a lovely, I think it was a Scots Guardsman with them, and he said, I've done, this is my second training, and I promised myself this time I wouldn't get too attached, but it's super hard.
Yeah.
And you just are like, oh gosh, just tough. But.
And Karen, what's your sense, to touch on a point that Anna raised, at the end of the war, when we get to the kind of post-conflict reconstruction stage, will that stay the same for women? Will they build on those foundations, or will things have to go back a step, a little bit more in the direction that they were?
And I agree with Anna. I think the society has changed in so many ways because of this war. We have this very different Ukrainian people, Ukrainian nation. They're jettisoning the Soviet, art infrastructure, all sorts of things. Obviously, there will be problems after the war. There's so many challenges to rebuilding a country. And it's not clear that the war is going to really end in a way that will be satisfactory. I suspect it might linger for some time. We may end up with a North Korea, South Korea armistice situation, which the Russians would like, because that means that it would be harder for Ukraine to join NATO and the EU if there's still conflict in parts of the country. But I think there's no turning back for anyone in Ukraine, actually. I mean, the women and the men.
And Anna, what about those women in particular who have been victims of sexual violence, systematic rape that Catherine's talked about? How do communities that have been affected by that recover or try and get past that trauma?
This is a very big problem and a very hard crime, because conflict-related sexual violence, only in 2008 it was recognized at the international level as a weapon of war. And the Russians are doing this. And so this crime, it affects not only physically the victim or survivor, but it also affects the community and the network of the survivor, and it damages it. So it has a very negative, invisible effect, which is very difficult to identify and to research. So there are only 155 cases registered of conflict-related sexual violence. And conflict-related sexual violence is not only rape. There are many different acts that can be classified as conflict-related sexual violence. But what is particular about this war and about Russian military, that they do rape, and they rape often on public people. Yeah, and in front of community, in front of relatives, and they rape people in groups. So, like a group of military personnel, and it's not discouraged by the commanders. They know about it. So, sexual violence and any type of gender-based violence in Ukraine and worldwide is a very stigmatized topic. It's a taboo topic. It's a shame to talk about it. It's a shame to say that you became a victim of this, because for some reason, often society, including Ukrainian society, would ask the survivor why it happened to you. Like, were you in the wrong timeout, or maybe you were wearing something, or maybe you said something. So there is still this blaming and shaming of a victim. It is still happening. There is a lot of work done by civil society and government to educate the population about how to behave in such situations, how to report, and that the perpetrator is the one to blame, not the survivor. But we know that there are only 155 cases registered. Ukrainian government and UN agencies and civil society organizations say that it's not even the tip of an iceberg. It's just a little like grain. The actual number of survivors is way higher, and the example of other countries show that women and men start talking about it years after. So we even don't know how. Well, we will never know the extent of this crime, but hopefully with time we will know more about these cases, and hopefully there will be some justice. And
On the point about justice, you say that so few have been recorded as crimes. Also, there's this stigma attached to it, which may incentivize people who are victims perhaps to keep quiet. How do you foresee justice being served here? Do you think it will be possible to catch the individual Russian soldiers responsible for this sexual violence?
I honestly don't know. I asked several people who are involved in investigation, and they are also very hesitant about giving a very direct answer. But what I know that they are trying to convince people to speak, and to the idea is that the more people speak, the more survivors report, the more information about perpetrators they collect, and then having more information will ideally help to find those people who did it. But another question is whether you can arrest them physically, if they are still alive, and where they are, and how do you find them. And so it's an open question. And I think that the also example of the war in Balkan countries shows us that in fact not many people were how do I say this? Prosecuted, yes.
There has been, I know of one conviction that's been secured, but it's in absentia. And that was the case. It was a woman whose testimony I took quite early in the war because she was from one of the areas around Kyiv where the Russians would push back. And she fled to her in-laws. And I think she really only reported the crime because the in-laws pushed her to, because her husband had been killed by the soldiers who then raped her. So they were very quickly able to identify him, because he revealed his identity to his victim. And he's been tried in absentia, so they've secured that conviction. But yeah, you wonder, how satisfying is that? And will that have to be the way that justice is parcelled out to Ukrainians, because they, have no chance of actually catching these people? So I don't know. I mean, I've spoken to the head of who you'll know, Irina, the sexual crimes prosecutor, and it does sound like they're determined to go ahead with some within absentia trials.
Yeah, and another dimension of injustice, well, at least on paper, I don't know, I never talked about this with survivors. What would justice be for them? What do they mean by justice? But it's reparations and compensation, and it's a doubtful form of justice, but it also can be as another dimension of it, not the persecution, but also reparations.
And Catherine, so you've spoken, I know, to many victims of this kind of violence. How difficult is it to get people to open up? And
very difficult. Yeah, very difficult. They'll usually ask you, obviously, to change their names, to leave out, certain details. And I'm thinking of the woman's story that I told in the most depth. That I put it to her that this could help bring, because it was the first case, it was the first one to be filed as a police report, so it was the first case really to become public, and that I said, the hope would be that it would raise awareness that this was actually happening and that needed to be stopped, and that others like her who were perhaps too timid to come forward to the authorities might come forward when they realised that it wasn't just them, that this was happening. And I think that's also I think exposing the systematic nature of the violence is very important, because I think that may help survivors feel less to blame or personally culpable if they see this as part of the Russian war machine. And I think that is starting to happen. Obviously, it's still difficult for individuals, but I think that it's now so well known in Ukrainian society that the Russians are doing this, that it may, and obviously there is a view amongst Ukrainians as Russians, for some good reason, of being fairly brutal, monstrous fighters. That having that out there may defray their sense of personal, responsibility, which obviously is not their responsibility at all.
Then I think, sorry, this is true that the more they talk about it, I hope the more people will start understanding that it's not personal It was crime committed not against somebody personally, but it's just the tactics. It doesn't matter who was at the street at that time.
And Catherine, I know obviously you are an absolute star foreign correspondent for The Times, for the Sunday Times. We've got Louise Callaghan, Christina Lamb. But what does that, when we look at the wider picture of female foreign correspondents, it seems to me obvious, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, that women who've been victims of this kind of violence are more likely to talk to female reporters.
Oh gosh, yes, yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. Yes, so I mean that was probably the first thing that opened the door to us, was that I work with a female fixer and I'm female. So I think that's really critical. I think it's...
But how common are women reporters on the ground in Ukraine?
I think we're very common now. I think that I mean, it's funny, people have talked about this for years. We're like, female war correspondents, like we're something special. And I don't think we are anymore. And the other question people ask are, do women cover war differently? Do they write about it? I think that everyone writes differently now because of the number of women who came in. So if you look back at sort of very old kind of, antique Times reports from the Crimean War and stuff, there's a completely different emphasis when it was a male-dominated field. And then you had, when women started to engage, their focus switched. So they weren't just sort of writing about, military kit. They were writing about how civilians were impacted and about the whole of war, not just the battlefield. And so I think that everyone really, male and female, in my profession do that now. But I do think that women have a certain advantage in that we are able to go into female communities, particularly, I mean, I'm thinking way beyond Ukraine, where gender stereotypes or, roles are much more entrenched. Places like Afghanistan, I think it's very difficult for men to be able to talk to women. So I see it as it opening more doors to me than my male colleagues have open to them.
Well, we should be grateful for the likes of you going out there and telling us all about it. And I'm sure I do remember the big front page you did about the first rape, which was a really harrowing and hard-hitting piece. Karen, moving on to something a little less bleak in subject. As you said, you don't think it's necessarily coming anytime soon and won't necessarily be a concrete way that this war plays out. But once we do get to the post-conflict reconstruction stage, what role do women in particular have to play there?
It's an interesting question. I think one thing I forgot to mention is I think after this war, the Ukrainian military is likely to be one of the best militaries in Europe, and other militaries will be learning from them. They've learned so fast. It's one of the fastest learning tech industries. I don't know how many women are in the tech industry, but they've done incredible things with the digital infrastructure, including using it during the war. If you meet the young Minister of Digital Affairs, and others who talk about the transition or the transformation in Ukraine, they'll say that the Ukrainian digital infrastructure or their innovation and their ability is after the United States and Israel's third in the world. So I think there's so many transformations happening. I think in so many ways the economy has proved to be far more robust. Obviously, there's still enormous challenges, and I think 30% of the budget is paid for by external powers, but there hasn't been a run on the banks there. I mean, unlike in, by the way, other parts of the world. So, it's the resiliency is what's so impressive, and that cuts across the entire society. And then the fact that what we were just talking about earlier about the women surging, really becoming the spokespeople for this war, I just think it's transformational. I don't see how things can go back. I really don't in this case. I know what you mean. So often, get back to, we're going to be the doctors and the lawyers who get kicked out of universities and all of that. I just think the society has changed if you keep a president like Zelensky, who is very empowering and supportive of this. You have, a lot of women in senior ministerial positions, etc. So, we're dealing with a different country in many ways. We have to hope that so much of the cohesion that's been built up during this war can be maintained afterwards. And that's the concern about all the billions that will go into reconstruction, making sure that's not stolen. They know that. They know people will be watching very carefully. They're thinking through that already. They're thinking through a lot of transition challenges already. I've never seen a country, I've followed, conflict and post-conflict and transition in dozens of places, and I've never seen anything quite like this.
Do either of you want to come in on that?
Yeah. As we mentioned before, the role of women in keeping the Ukrainian society going right now is really important and big. But we made a research and a rapid assessment of gendered impacts of this war in 2022 in spring. And what we saw was that women's roles at the local level and the community level has increased, but women's involvement into the decision making at the national level has decreased. So because decisions have to be done fast, and there is no time to organize all these public consultations with civil society to agree upon everything. So they got excluded to some extent, and there is a fear that it will remain like this because it works. even if women are not fully involved, and we have the experience of this war it's going on for 9 years already, and women haven't been fully involved into the peace negotiation process, and there was a lot of debate about including women's voices into the peace process. And there are different ways how you can do it. They can be sitting on the table and negotiating. You can have another group of women who will do all the consultations and then bring the results to the negotiation table and things like this. So we don't have this mechanism at the moment, but there is a need to include more female voices into the peace process when if the peace process starts. And when it starts, and the process regarding post-conflict recovery, I think that women should be involved into this process as well, because they're doing a lot now, and they are very effective at the local level, and they have a lot of experience, they have a lot of knowledge, and they have a lot of information to contribute. They have a lot of experience to contribute to the recovery process, and I think they shouldn't be excluded. And also, in fact, what they're doing, there are so many challenges for the government at the moment that they cannot do everything. They cannot provide all the services as they did before. And we have more vulnerable population than we had before. So it's really challenging. And civil society and a lot of times women's organizations are supporting it. They are holding the back. So yes, I think that exactly because of this experience and their contribution now, there will be a need to build this mechanism, how they can be involved into the peace process and post-conflict recovery later. But we have it's the topic of my work, but we have the National Action Plan on implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. It's like a general framework about how you integrate gender issues during the conflict period and in the post-conflict period. And there they wrote that women must be involved into the post-conflict recovery. It's just that, so there is in general, there is commitment to involve more women into this process. The question now is when it will happen and how it will happen.
Don't you think the women will demand to be there?
I'm sure.
I don't think they're going to get out of the way.
No, I'm sure that
I was reminded when you said that about women having information. There's this great story that Hillary Clinton tells, because this was one of her causes, was women in peacemaking, and all the evidence pointing towards peace being more enduring when women are involved, and that if you literally analyze all the peace deals struck when they excluded women, they were more likely to fall apart. And the story she tells was about some mediation going on somewhere in the world where the two sides were fighting over access to a river, to the water, and it was all male, and they couldn't come to any agreement over it, somewhere in Africa, I think, which communities would have rights to this water. And then eventually someone came up with the idea of involving the women of the community, and when they came in, they were able to say, because they're the ones who collect the water, and that river dried up 10 years ago. So there's no point in it even being involved. And I mean, I just think that's such a telling story. But I also think that in terms of, what happens after the war, and indeed, when it happens, because I, like you, don't hold out much hope of a real negotiated settlement. And I've used the Korean example several times when speaking to people about how this could go. A frozen conflict or a war of attrition that sort of bubbles along that line. But I think that that as we see this sort of high-speed evolution of Ukrainian society during this war, and a change in sort of attitudes towards these old Soviet practice and things, we're seeing a new generation come to the fore as well, and they're the generation that were forged in movements like the Maidan, where there were lots of women quite prominently involved in that. And so I think Zelensky is a young leader, and against the old, Putin is from the past, and in some ways he represents the future, and his lovely young children, and it's just a young family.
And Madam Zelenska has been
exactly she's been a huge force for good during this. I just think that there's a different, it's just a new generation that has different ideas about gender roles anyway. So, there's an American transgender woman fighting for the Ukrainians.
Is that? Yeah. I was thinking of asking you whether we'd seen any sort of foreign mercenaries who are women, trans women.
I only know Sarah. I don't know of any cis women who've joined up, but yes, she's there, and is completely accepted by by all her comrades, her cis male comrades.
Yes, yeah, fascinating.
There are Ukrainian transgender women as well
at the front line.
Yeah, I don't know how many, but there are.
Fascinating. Well, we'll have to carry that conversation on another time. That's all we've got time for today, but my huge thanks to Karen von Hippel, Anna Kvit and Catherine Philp. Thanks also to producers Joe Crawford and Louis Sykes. You've been watching Frontline with Lucy Fisher for Times Radio.